Alright everyone, it's time to talk about censorship again, and it's a common theme lately. I wonder why. In the wake of course, more attacks on alt tech and on independent content creators, but it's become so common at this point. Hit pieces, defamation, outright in some cases, against, people like me. It's become so common that I don't even individually cover instances of it usually unless it's particularly out there, like with Tim Pool and the piece about him and the cat. It's that's so bizarre, and again, it comes from the Daily Beast, and they're always worth a chuckle, so it's different. But there are so many different, if I were to make, I'd have to make a whole new channel with a dozen video uploads a day, probably, just to cover, major losses of videos by major creators, just due to the AI systems on YouTube. YouTube right now is all over the place. Even their processing is slower. I think it's because they're dedicating so many resources to purging stuff off the site. They're making up for lost time, going back through billions and billions of videos, and their system just can't fucking process things as quickly. I have literally tried this. Try this. Make a video, a couple minutes long. Upload it simultaneously to YouTube and Dailymotion and see which one is available first. Just go ahead and do that. And I think Dailymotion has full 1080 capabilities now as well. Do that. See which one's ready first. 9 times out of 10 it'll be Dailymotion, and Dailymotion is essentially a dead platform. So that should tell you something. I think YouTube is the slowest. I think the runner-up would be, Rumble, but that's because they're so overburdened by growth at the moment. I think they need new servers. But I just wanted to cover censorship in a more general sense. And of course, this is sort of preaching to the choir, if, it's on Sticks, Hex, and Hammer 666's channel. But censorship is un-American. I'm going to approach it this time just from the concept of patriotism. Now, this is a loaded term. Patriotism is almost always used in the context of propaganda. It means different things to different people. If I look at the general founding of the United States and maybe the more strict definition that would have been applied by the people that actually created the notion of the Great American Experiment, it would essentially be, and our original slogan was in line with this, it was literally mind your own business. First motto of the United States before E Pluribus Unum several years later, by the way, mind your own business. I think Benjamin Franklin was the one who dreamed that one up. He wanted the turkey, by the way, to be our national bird. He's like, well, the eagles all over Europe, they've already got this bird. Why don't we have a turkey? And wiser heads prevailed on that one. Very good dude. Strategically, in that case, would have been, I think, a blunder. It would have been funny, though. Can you imagine the memes of them? Anyway, they would have considered virtually any form of censorship, both private or government in nature, state in nature, to be unacceptable. One of the things that you had, this is the backdrop, for instance, for freedom of the press. The reason why it was instituted is what we need to look at. I like to do this. Look at the different parts of the Constitution and envision why they were considered important to pass. For instance, with the 10th Amendment, the idea that each of these states should have certain capabilities unto themselves and a further limitation of federal power was specifically because in Europe it became a problem. Localities and provinces were subjugated so heavily to national authorities that you could get a situation, for example, and they were economic geniuses. These people were classically trained in up-to-date methodology and economics at the time. You'd have the Crown, or Parliament or whatever, make a decision. And they wouldn't look at the difference between the area where they were, which tended to be urban, like London or something, and the boondocks. The coal fields of the Midlands or something like that, the Iron Hills. They didn't care. So you had constant peasant rebellions, you had constant poverty in these outlying areas, you had constant poverty even within the cities in many cases, because policy was not made based on the general consensus of the state as a whole. It was based on a few urban areas. It was based on what was good for the aristocracy and cosmopolitan urbanites. That's why there's a 10th Amendment. Why is there a 4th Amendment? Because, in Great Britain specifically, and everywhere else in the world, the government could come in and rifle through your shit any time and make sure that you weren't being a dissident. It caused many problems. It caused riots and protests, and people died, and it was understood that this was a problem, that the government should have to have reasonable constraints on their ability to randomly come into your home or search you on the street, because it was a problem. The Second Amendment. Why would you need a right to keep and bear arms? Because repeated attempts were being made by their own government, which is what the regulars, the redcoats were. Those were their own military. They were commanded to disarm people. All they had done was stockpile arms. They didn't even necessarily do that initially just to fight off our own government because they've been harassing us. Fuck, you'd want to maintain a stockpile. You're on the frontier. If you're in the colonies at the time, you could get attacked at any moment by a hostile native tribe, or the Spaniards could land ships there or something. Of course you want to stockpile. Most of the troops are over in Europe. The troops that are there are harassing you regularly. You feel completely helpless. That's why there's a Second Amendment. And it specifically refers to military arms. Supreme Court has reaffirmed this several times. Why is there a First Amendment? And this is the point of the video, anti-censorship. Because censorship was a problem, and it wasn't always the result of a decision by government. Censorship in Europe at the time often took the form of a state banning a book. They said, well, this book is obscene. It insults the Queen. This one's religiously obscene. It questions the Church of England or something. And so books were banned. Private printers, though, at their own discretion would do the same thing. That is, if you had a printing monopoly, let's say, you're living in the 1700s and there's like 4 printing presses in the town. The old wooden kind with manual typeset and everything else. Hand bound, of course. You print books a lot faster than copying them by hand, but it was still a lot of work. You got 4 presses in your town. You want to release something spicy. Some 1700s erotic literature. It talks about women's knees and stuff in a very obscene manner. It's sort of like the Song of Solomon. And all of those presses say no. Well, back then, what are you going to do? Are you going to go on horseback to the next city with a printing press that might be 200 miles away? That could be a little bit of a problem. Now, that in essence is vestigial, but only because free speech has been maintained on platforms of technology that are greater than old manual printing presses. We now have fully electronic press systems. You can self-publish on Amazon, and 1 million books can sell within a week if it's really good. They can print them on demand. They ship them out for you. You can do that. There are other printing services. There are 1 million small book binders and stuff in the Western world that have their own pressing system that are capable of making volumes, hardcover, leather-bound, everything like that. Although it's difficult to work with publishers, I will say. It's very difficult. The literary world is not like it was maybe 30 or 40 years ago, and I've noted that publishers tend to be very, very slow and change their mind constantly. I've tried working with a half a dozen of them. Trust me, it's not as easy as you would think. Amazon, meanwhile, is much easier, which is why they're being targeted by the woke crowd to try to censor publishing on demand so much. The underlying basis of, for instance, the right to free speech explicitly was about obscene speech and stuff likely to get you banned, blasphemy, sexual speech, rhetoric that would be considered fiery if not necessarily harassing or inciting. Beyond that, though, that was explicitly what the First Amendment was meant to protect. Free speech for interpersonal conversations. You're on the street corner shouting at people through a bullhorn. You're talking at the dinner table, something like that. Freedom of the press, which means printing presses. It means literature, newspapers, billets, things like that. It doesn't mean the press is in the press corps. It's very funny. Americans learn so little history usually in school unless they're taking AP courses that if they are, they go to college, then maybe they have different political opinions by and large. By the end of that, not saying there's indoctrination there because I went to UVM and look at me now, but there's a certain ethos on campus that generally doesn't get questioned so much as the others. And anyway, the whole idea is that the press is literal presses. There are so many Americans that think it refers to the White House press corps, like Fox and CNN and stuff like that. Well, that's the press. Trump is attacking the press when he criticizes them. No, the Democrats have attacked the press repeatedly when they attempt to censor online commentary. It's been literally called for. They've called for this repeatedly. Some Republicans, by the way, have too. There are no exceptions to censorship being un-American. It's the First Amendment for a reason. Literally, the first 2 components of the very First Amendment both deal with free expression. It's the ultimate ethos, the ultimate guiding principle of the United States, that individuals shouldn't be harassed or abused in any way, public or private, by the state or by private entities, simply because of their beliefs and expressing them. The whole idea of expressing bizarre beliefs was kind of a popular thing, by the way. Another historical fact that many Americans don't understand. In the era before radio and television became common, it was very fashionable for people to get together at the town hall and hold debates. Oratory. Sometimes they got transcribed down. I've edited books of them. Oratory. The debate over fire and brimstone Protestant versus Catholic. The debate over Spiritism versus Orthodox religiosity. The atheist religion debate. All big things, by the way, in the 19th century. Huge things. This was what people did for sport. For half a century, this was basically how people interacted. They got into debates. Sometimes they devolved into brawls. They held debates. They would stand around, and my grandfather used to talk about this. And this is in the era where you've already got radio and stuff. He'd say, oh, the old timers would go down to the store and they'd buy one newspaper between them, and then they'd read and they'd talk about it for hours. They'd debate, on a pension or something like that. An old farmer dude, and your kids are feeding you. You go down, grab a newspaper, have a couple of shots of whiskey, and you'd spend hours debating with your friends over which politician was more stupid. This was what people did, and they had very unorthodox opinions. We see now that even very mundane materials are being censored. I'm part of the Archive Everything movement, which is every news link should be archived, because they usually try to weasel around later and sanitize their own stuff. Stalinize it, I would say. And everything should be stored as well, digital or hard copy. Books are valuable. Files, video files and stuff like that, you disconnect them from the cloud and keep them locally on a hard disk. Trust me, 50 years from now, 99% of that content won't exist anywhere else other than the tape drive that you invested in. I've got backups of all sorts of videos that I like. Music, videos, books, all of these things, because otherwise they'll be disappeared. It's probably also a good idea to maintain an older pre-Windows 10 computer that can't be fucked around with remotely by big corporations that will probably be pressured by various governments to do so. Censorship is un-American. There's no place for it there's really no place for it in the American continent. Unfortunately, you got a few Soviet-style states there that sort of muck that up. That's about all. Peace out.